Good morning. Good morning again for those people already greeted. I'm very happy to be with you this morning. A bit impressed by the names mentioned here, but I'm very happy. So we shall continue this session, and I will try to concretely and practically look at what can be implemented for the management of this transition period and its management. I shall also talk about a few monitoring elements, my objective being to be proactive, not to bear with things. I want to be proactive because it is important to implement a monitoring warning systems if need be. So, this is what I want to talk about. I try to identify the 4 pillars that I can consider as being unavoidable if we are to have a successful transition. It's rather on the same vein as what has been presented earlier on. So I shall be talking about calcemia. I won't be talking about hypoclinical hypocalcemia here. We shall be just focusing on subclinical hypocalcemia. I will talk about the energy status and also about ingestion, a key element for a successful transition for me as well. I have a big chunk about inflammation, immunity, and stress, all these different aspects that were tackled by Francis Saint-Jalbert. And the 4th pillar, less a metabolic one, it is less of a nutrition element, but however, an important and key element in the drying. That's the other health, and it is key. So as for all these topics and items, I will have a kind of dual approach. The resources deployed, do I have to prepare calvings in terms of energy? So everything that is being deployed. And in parallel, what cows say, I would say, the answers of our animals, given what we deploy, and a few concluding words. So to introduce myself, yes, well, briefly, I'm a veterinarian. I graduated in 1998 from the Veterinary School of Liège. I moved to Brittany in the year 2000. And as for my professional practice, I monitor quite a lot of herds, reproduction, and so on, nutrition, milk quality, and depending on the requests of the farmers. I also have a service provision activity for feed manufacturers, technical support, training, attending seminars and conferences. So I'm based in Brittany. I'm part of the so-called Cristal network that will be celebrating its 30th anniversary this year. Now, let's talk about hypocalcemia. And to illustrate this subclinical hypocalcemia, I present a survey by Verdoolaege, 750 cows. The objective was to characterize the risk associated to subclinical hypocalcemia. The threshold for hypocalcemia was defined at 2.15 millimole, so rather high level, and the higher the level, the easiest it is to reach hypocalcemia. And despite this high level, the associated risks for the various pathologies that bring about lactations are rather high. 3.7 for moving abomasum, 5 times more possibilities of having ketosis. Risk is multiplied by 4 for metritis. Placental retention is also increased. And the possibilities of an estrus before 60 days is multiplied by 3. So this pathology has high consequences, and its frequency, depending on publications, is around 50% in terms of incidence. when we reach second lactation. So all this being quite substantial, making it a topic from an economic standpoint and for the performance of the farm. Now, diagnosis of the subclinical hypocalcemia. When I started working, the recommendations were to make a calcium dosage as rapidly as possible after calving. Today, we are somewhat going away from this principle. The idea is that, as was presented for ketonic bodies previously, today we have a series of cows presenting hypocalcemia, but they do manage it rather well themselves. This is what has been presented in this 2017 publication. Hypocalcemia, but rapidly go back to normal values. And what is more interesting for identification are these cows here, those having a hypocalcemia but having difficulties in coming back to correct calcium values. These animals will, of course, go more into a vicious circle. So we kind of postpone the time of sampling. As for threshold, well, I have to mention one, and there are different thresholds being mentioned in scientific papers, but here I took this 2018 survey mentioning the incidence of hypocalcemia depending on lactation. First level, we have a threshold of 2 millimoles, and third line is 2.2 millimoles, so the difference is very, very tiny. And the incidence of subclinical cases for hypocalcemia is very much modified. First lactation here, 5% incidence if the threshold is 2 millimole, and 36% incidence first lactation if threshold is 2.2 millimoles. Now, if we are interested in the incidence of this hypocalcemia, we have to we must know what we're talking about and be quite careful about the thresholds used. From a technical standpoint, shouldn't use a DBTA tube and possible preservation for 7 days in a fridge without any modification of the value. This may appear as an anecdote, but it is interesting when implementing that on a farm. If you are to make samples each time you have a calving, it is complicated, so we don't do it much. If the farmer can make the samples, store them in a fridge, and once a week they are sent to the lab or the veterinarian, then the diagnosis is easier. The monitoring aspect is very much interesting here. Now let's talk about how to prevent hypocalcemia. But what is key is the calcium values around calving. We can measure a lot of things, but this value is key. Now, from a prevention standpoint, what can we bring? Well, calcium intake at calving. It can be an interesting approach. It is often done in the field. This practice at calving is very common. We can play on the anion cation assessment. We can play on on limiting calcium intake at calving. We can work with what we call calcium binder, limiting the availability of calcium for the animal, and we can also bring vitamin D. Why do we so? To control hypocalcemia? Well, vitamin D, once activated in the liver and the kidney, it will increase the absorption and digestibility of calcium in the intestine, and thus the availability in calcium for the animal. Calcium input or intake at calving. Repeating a publication by Martinez in 2016, 450 cows, two strategy for calcium input. First 86 gram day 0 and day 1 to the animal, and another strategy of 4 days, 86 grams for the first 2 days, and then half, 43 grams until day 4. On those animals having a high level of production, previous lactation had a production higher than the average of the herd. We have a long-standing positive effect up to 30 days, so a beneficial a benefit for this calcium input intake. What type of calcium should we bring? We may think about injectable pathway, intravenous or oral pathways. So on this publication dating 2014, 33 cows, hypocalcemia. We have a control batch. This is the black curve. It takes time to come back to a normal calcium level. We have a batch with intravenous infusion of calcium. Here we can see a quick increase in calcemia because it's direct input. But this hypercalcemia that we do generate intravenously is having consequences. It kind of inhibits the release of PTH, and it creates an activated calcitonin. So as a response to hypercalcemia, we can have a rebound effect, and we go through a hypocalcemia phase. So the oral pathway has an interest, as we can avoid the rapid input and this hypercalcemia phase, and then have a softer recovery that lasts longer in time. So that is for calcium intake. Now, as for the BACA, I am mentioning again the study by Santos. It is a meta-analysis of different public on how to manage hypocalcemia with the implementation of diet with a negative BACA. In the meta-analysis, there were 42 publications, 130 treatments, 1,800 cows. So each dot is a datum. So as for clinical effects, we can see that there is a real trend for a decrease in clinical cases when we lower the assessment here. This is for multiparous. Placenta retention risk and assessment effect. The more negative the assessment, the risk of placenta retention decreases. As for abomasum, we can see that there are different strategies here. The more acidified the diet, then the risk of abomasum for abomasum is risk. An increase in the risk for primiparis. Why? When we acidified our diet on primiparis, that's because the latter are less sensitive to hypocalcemia. We saw it earlier on. The work on incidence. The incidence of subclinical hypocalcemia is rather limited for primiparis, but if we have a negative BACA, then we could have consequences in terms of ingestion. And the movement of abomasum is a problem. And to avoid this, the cow has to eat a lot. Otherwise, we have a lot of risk of moving abomasum. Generally speaking, the incidence of pathologies, any type of pathologies at the beginning of lactation decreases when the BACA is negative, and there is a positive impact regarding the ingested dry matter postpartum, or ingested postpartum, sorry. And as for production, the trend is to increase production for animals that received a negative BACA preparation. Overall, given this meta-analysis, we can say that having a negative BACA approach means that calcemia goes from 1.86 millimole to 2.04. In other words, we're getting closer to the threshold defined to characterize hypocalcemia. We have an increase in ingested dry matter of around 1 kilograms, and production increases by 1.7 kilograms per day if we compile all the publications. In the field, now, what can we look at so as to assess the efficiency of this negative ABACA approach? One of the first topics we can work on is urine pH. There's a strong correlation, as you can see here, correlation between the BACA level and the urine pH. Classically speaking, for BACA around 0, we'll have a pH that'll be around 7. And the more negative the BACA, then minus 50, minus 100 milliequivalent of kilograms of dry matter, then the closer to 6 the pH. As for objectives, mentioning here between 7.5 and 6, some recommendations recommend going even lower, but careful here because you want to have a negative pH. We have a strong metabolical acidosis in animal. It leads to a higher excretion of calcium in the kidneys. So we need to supplement calcium in the diet. In recommendations, we recommend 10 grams or even more of calcium for carving preparation. I'm still convinced that this highly negative BACA supplementation is a risk, or can be a risk, so we should be careful about the impact of these. pH, of course, is measured with pH paper. It works well, pH meter, but pH paper works very well. And there's a possibility to either make sounding or massage. It works well if the animal is not too much stressed. So the farmer can use this method. Now, points to watch. Consequences regarding appetence and impact on ingested dry matter. Other information given by the measurement of urine pH when you have irregular measurements, one cow being at 6, another one at 8, it means that the homogeneity of the mix is not correct. Or if it is distributed over 2 days and then from one day to another you don't have the same diet because the diet eats what it wants, or not everything is eating the same thing. So I would say irregularity in consumption. This is something we can regularly observe, and again, urine pH is of interest for that. Third strategy to avoid hypocalcemia, it's the reduction of calcium at the end of the drying period. The objective is to keep stimulating the PTH secretion, and the regulation mechanisms for calcemia are activated before the high request at the beginning of lactation. The objective, if we want to keep activating PTH to be below 20 grams of calcium per day in practice, can be quite complicated. Another strategy, in addition to BACA, can be the use of calcium binder. It is not much used in France. It is regularly seen in North European countries. These are zeolites that limit the availability in calcium for the animal. In such a study, 60 cows had a distribution of zeolites for 3 weeks, corresponding to a preparation phase as is classically observed in the field. And we can see here that animals supplemented with zeolites have higher calcemia at calving compared to control animals. It can be an interesting approach, yet the question can be if these zeolites do not absorb something else. Here we're focusing on calcium, but what about trace elements and so on? And there's also a possible inertia effect of these zeolites at calving. We want to limit the availability of calcium before calving, but once calving is done, of course, we need to have a maximum. Now, this is another possible solution, but as any other solution, it has advantages and drawbacks. Now, the use of vitamin D. This vitamin D is playing a key role so as to regulate calcium. It has a role to play regarding immunity and mammary epithelium, so it is rather relevant to use this vitamin D. There's an interest for activated forms. In this 2020 survey, about 60 cows, supplementation with inactive vitamin D for 3 weeks, 2 different doses, and another batch of cows receiving vitamin D that had been already activated once, so hydroxydated 25. And from a serum standpoint, in the blood, what we can see that the more vitamin D, inactivated vitamin D, the higher the vitamin D in the serum, but the curve is rather vertical. As we can see, there's no rapid transfer of our inactivated vitamin D into the hydroxide form. So the interest is really to supplement with activated forms, as they have a very efficient impact. To conclude on that part about hypocalcemia, the same concern as my colleague. The curve is missing, can't be seen on screen. So this is a survey by Leblanc in 2017. For this survey, 60 cows. On the one hand, 30 being in a building with a low density, 80%. And on the other side, we have 120% occupancy of the building, of the second building. And here, you have the overstocked animals, so overdensity. For these overdensity animals, for the preparation of calving, we have a calcemia at calving time. It decreases for all the group because it is a physiological phenomenon at the beginning of calving, but it decreases more in this overdensity group. So it is really interesting that these figures and curves should be published. It is something that we often find in the field. Well, things may be changed in the field, but most of the time when a farmer wants to invest in a building, it starts with cows in lactation, so overdensity in calving preparation. It has consequences at different levels, but even for calcemia, it is having an impact. And we can see a link regarding albumin content, as this can contribute, since part of the calcium is connected to albumin in the blood. So this can be an explanation to what we can observe regarding calcemia. So that was for calcemia. Now, let's leave macro elements and try and see what we can do with other elements outside this direct phase around calving. We have a high homeostasis regulation of most of these macro elements that is rather fine. So it's rather disappointing from a blood standpoint. If you want to assess the input level and how the animals are supplemented, you need to work on urines. Here you have the recommendations. And to kind of illustrate what I'm saying here, we can see the strong correlation between, and the case is magnesium, so strong correlation between absorbed magnesium and the one in urines. Urines act as a magnet, and with that we can assess the input levels, something that's difficult to find in the blood. Now I want to leave my first presentation. Now I want to talk about the energy status. We can trust what we can see, the body conditions. There are tools that are not widely used, but they do still exist. I've never seen one operating in the field, but another possibility, this is the de Laval camera. You can give a corporal ranking of animals when the animals go into a corridor or when you use this kind of machine. But this body condition mark, and has been mentioned by the previous presentation, it gives interesting information. And this is what you can obtain with the software we use routinely. Each cow is given a mark, and thus you can make an assessment. As an example, for second lactation, the trend is to be below the curve when compared to other animals. And you follow the evolution of these criteria, you can evidence quite a number of things. So energy status, body state mark is something of interest. And here you have the origin of two parameters. That's the NIFES and the BHBs. I don't want to dwell too much time on that. It has already been presented by my two previous colleagues. So, the beginning of the story, when you have an energy deficit, the release of non-esterified fatty acid, and for hepatocytis, different possible scenarios here, but limited regarding the efficiency of our cytokine Krebs, and one leading to the production of ketonic bodies or accumulation of triglycerides, and thus steatosis. We can monitor these non-esterified fatty acids, these NIFAs. When? Well, when are we measured these NIFAs? Well, classically, before carving, the NIFAs, if we come back to our story here, they come earlier than the ketonic bodies. The interest is for before carving, and the threshold is 4.4 millimoles. Associated risk, if we are to trust Stéphane Leblanc's surveys, we increase the risk in removing abomasum, the risk in placenta retention, and so on. So how can we limit the risk? We can make blood samples, and on the cold, we make our tests, but they are so-called portable solutions, this system that allows us to measure NIFAs directly in the office, and then we have the photometer that allows us to measure the NIFAs and calcium. As for NIFAs, that's the measure of BHBs. We have different devices available in order to measure these BHBs directly next to the animals. When to do it? In the first months of lactation, We don't have a lot of literature about that. I'm not saying that there's no interest in doing it before calving, but we have less literature, so we prefer using an EFA before calving. But we have a lot of literature after calving. And the threshold value, again, varies between 1.2 and 1.4 millimoles of BHB per liter of blood. I'm not going to... we can see an increase in the peripartum pathologies, an increase in BHBs at the beginning of lactation. It can be done with blood, but also milk or urines. Sensitivity is not as efficient. Gold standard is BHB in blood. From a method standpoint, and this has been proposed by Jocelyn Dubuc, here the idea is to measure BHBs during the first week of lactation and third week of lactation, as the objective is to make a difference between the two types of ketosis. When you have an increase in BHB at the beginning of lactation, we are facing a type 2 ketosis, so you need to know what's taking place before calving and during preparation. So we need to keep this body condition score before and after drying to see if there's a modification in the BCS during drying. As for dry matter, for calving preparation, it is most of the times problematic. With the size of our French herds, these ratios are difficult to measure. The diets are difficult to make. Mixes are not always used. Sometimes we do it by hand because we just have few animals to feed for preparation. So to measure the dry matter in preparation is not always easy. Now we can also add an EFA measurement before calving. Third week, that's more of a type 1 ketosis. That's for the start, dry matter at the beginning of lactation, the UFL level, and so on. The way the animals are managed at the beginning of lactation. And the threshold depends on the farms, but the idea is to be below 20% of animals being over 1.2 millimoles. Now, from a prevention standpoint, ingestion or intake comes first. It is a key element. The objective for calving preparation, and again, classically speaking, we have 12, 13 kilo dry matter. Some farms can be higher. Sometimes we can see 15 dry matter intake for calving preparation, but it is a success lever for me for lactation start. Availability in diet, of course, has a role to play. The quality of the diet as well. And I'm mentioning here the fact of adding straw in the preparation of calving sometimes means that you can gain 1 or 2 kilograms of dry matter intake. So this is something that can improve the situation. Liver integrity means that here, when you have a liver malfunction, it can have consequences in terms of intake, and Francis Saint-Jalbert showed it. There's a link between this inflammatory phenomenon, intake, liver integrity. We have the 3 feet here: ingestion, inflammation, and liver integrity. Of course, you need to work on calving preparation. You must increase the diet in density, as animals often decrease the content of dry matter intake. It is meaningful to cover the needs to prepare the rumen flora, the rumen to what is going to take place at the beginning of lactation, and of course, the prevention of hypocalcemia. Now, the management of BCS, stress reduction, the use of glucose precursors. I mean here that we are to bring sources of starch, as starch is the best precursor for glucose, or glucose's production in cows, and of course more, I would say, dietary prevention, methionine, choline, betaine, for effects that have already been mentioned by Jose Santos previously. We can also mention the interest of sorbitol, niacin, monoprotein glycol, and monensin. I put it here as a dietary prevention because today this strategy is being used by some breeders, and it can guide bacterial fermentation to the production of propionate, a precursor of glucoses. Now, that was for prevention. Now, glucose and cholesterol. Glucose dosage in blood, cows, we do have variations as it depends on the time of the day and the time of the diet. While there are controversies regarding the use of it, some shows the limited interest in glucose dosage, but some papers show that. Mentioning here the Stevenson's paper and survey, they followed animals with or pathology or without, and at postpartum they measured a series of criteria, blood parameters and so on, among which glucose level. And the discriminating aspect of glucose between a healthy or diseased cows will show similar values in both categories. So it is not a criteria that is easy to understand at the level of the herd. For one given animal, of course, it can be of interest, but for the whole herd, it is complicated. So that's for glucose. Cholesterol, well, again, it has been shown as a high contributor to the VLDL contribution. Strong correlation between cholesterol and non-esterified fatty acids. The higher the level of NEFAs, then the higher the trend of producing VLDLs, and in which we'll have a strong correlation between VLDLs and cholesterol. This is to be understood jointly, but it is an interesting marker for the liver. We'll talk later about the liver, but this parameter is regularly used in the various liver indices. Again, other criteria, if I may say so, more classical ones. The milk useful substances, a series of ABAC repeating these values. This is of interest as these elements we all have, all dairy farms have TB, TP values, sometimes individual values. To have a diagnosis on all these values, difficult, but it may be an addition to the other elements we have seen earlier. But all this is to be considered as a diagnosis tool, as another pieces in the puzzle, really, that's all. You can have a joint understanding of TP and urea. So TP more correlated from an energy standpoint, and urea for protein. So we can thus assess the energy in the protein. So, energy status over. I don't know what time it is. I'm okay, I think. Now, inflammation, immunity, oxidative stress, that have been already detailed by Francis, so no need to go deeper here. So, aggression, this is rather vague as a word. It can be viral infection, bacterial infection, release of LPSs that has been mentioned earlier on. It can be a trauma. So anything that can lead to a macrophage stimulation. And then in the liver via cytokines, TNFs, we can see a production of APPs, acute phase proteins. They can be in the blood and at different levels. So among these, we have aptoglobin. Again, it has been widely mentioned earlier on. We have fibrinogen that can be measured, ceruloplasmin, and SAA, as it is a part of these inflammation marking proteins. To repeat and use again an illustration of what Francis said, I'm repeating and mentioning again this 2014 paper. We have between 270 cows, or around 270 cows, were monitored for 50 days before calving up to 25 days after calving. And the population of cows was segmented depending on the presence or not of metritis. So the metritis diagnosis was made around 25 days. And as Stevenson earlier on, we measured different criteria, aptoglobin, among which, and for those animals having metritis at day 25 during lactation, we can see that the aptoglobin values are over or superior right at the beginning of lactation and for 14 days. Then, when the metrite diagnosis is made, the aptoglobin values are rather similar in between two groups. So that's why I'm mentioning here the hen and the egg, because historically speaking, we would think that metritis could lead to an inflammation, but with such a publication, similarly to what Francis presented, may make us think conversely. Inflammation at calving may lead to a liver infection and an increase in NEFR and BHP and a decrease in immune capacities, hence the emergence of metritis. I lost my cow as well, sorry, but there should be a cow on screen. So it is from Bradford's publication. And Francis Angelbert mentioned this publication earlier on. It showed the key role of the liver in the inflammatory process at the beginning of lactation. We have free radicals being released. We have LPSs. We can also have a release of cytokines from the uterus or harder in terms of in case of mastitis. If the social context is complicated with overdensity, we can also have catecholamines, and heat stress can reinforce the whole phenomena. So the liver is the forefront, really, I would say, when we talk about inflammation at the beginning of lactation. And this is what is being confirmed in this study here, dating back to 2017. We looked at the level of plasmatic paraoxonase. It is a liver protein that is released in the blood. The higher the plasmatic paraoxonase, the better the quality of the liver functions. Those animals having the highest score are those that produce more and have BHP values at the beginning of lactations that are decreased. hence production consequences for production and ketosis risks. Same study as Francis earlier on. We can see consequences regarding a risk or a hazard of pathology at the beginning of lactation. Those animals that fare better for asthmatic plasminosis have fewer risk of developing a peripartum pathology compared to those that are at a disadvantage for parasmatic peroxidase. Now, the functional, I would say, exploration of the liver. We don't always have the best tools in veterinary medicine. Some indices were put forward. Here we have a publication by Bertoni. It shows the correlation between this index mentioning albumin, cholesterol, and the retinol binding protein. The better this index, the more the smaller the content in aptoglobin at the beginning of lactation. Other indices were put forward. We can integrate the bilirubin. There are several possibilities. We can have an interest in peroxidase, in plasmatic peroxidase, but it is not routinely proposed. The classic parameters, traditional parameters that we can look for when monitoring a herd, well, we have gamma GT. It is a marker of cholestasis or parasitism. We have LDH, acute liver damage here, and aspartate transaminase that can be found in the liver and in the muscles. Now let us focus on ingestion. This is a publication by Bertoni, 2009. It shows different categories of animals regarding ingestion at calving. We have different scenarios. Some animals can show a decrease in ingested dry matter at calving, but in a reduced way, and some others show a marked reduction. It can be late or early around calving. In this study, they looked at aptoglobin. Animals having a decrease in ingested, showing early decrease in ingestion dry matter, have a different level of aptoglobin, and levels increase rather rapidly. So close connection between the ingested dry matter and inflammation. Again, it's twice guilty, really. You have a decrease in ingested dry matter, but also an increase in needs. Inflammation is costly in terms of energy. Thus, it's a double sanction, I would say. You eat less, and you need to spend more because of the inflammation. Again, another publication showing the impact of dry matter ingested on pathology. So it dates back to 2007. 101 cows were monitored, distributed according to the presence of metritis, bitrate and endometritis, or absence of metritis at 3 weeks. So animals in blue here on this graph do not show metritis and eat more on the day of the diagnosis, but these animals were already eating more for a calving preparation. They were eating more than those cows presenting endometritis and an acute metritis. And endometritis cows were also eating more, whether at the time of diagnosis or during calving preparation, than those animals having a clinical metritis. So this ingestion is a key element. As for monitoring of ingestion, while things are not always easy in the field, we have a possibility to have sensors in the mixers in order to get to know the quantities being distributed on a daily basis. When you have such a system, feeding robots and so on, you can get different types of interesting information can be reported into the farmer's software. But we can also look at the animals, look at the rumen filling score, as it is information, but does you have information about animal intake. Now, stress. Now, comfort is of importance. Litter and the quality of the litter is really important when managing and monitoring dried cows. I said prefer straw-bedded areas. It's not detrimental at the time of drying. So straw-bedded areas or something comfortable, sand or compost, which won't see much here, but it brings some additional comfort. And of course, room is the essence, really, for stalls 130 centimeters. If we talk about comfort, I'm mentioning this publication of Dr. Dahl and students. It is reporting about the heat stress on dried cows. This study showed that the dried cows, when submitted to a heat stress, produced less. The decrease in mammary tissue at the beginning of lactation, and a decrease in milk production. That's for the cow itself. Now, if it is a gestating cow for a heifer, then we'll have a decrease in the growth of the animal, a decrease in the reproduction capacity of the heifer. We want to inseminate it, and the cow itself will keep the traces of the heat stress when in the body of a mother. So literature shows that if a fan is needed on a farm, it is first and foremost for dried cows. Social stress, a few words. Available area for animals. We have different publications showing that there are high consequences. Hutzel publication 2004, if the occupancy rate is over 80% in preparation stalls, we have a decrease in production up to 83 days for lactation for primiparus. And we also have an increase in the removing of masum, and when room is in between 30 and 60%. This is key for calving preparation. To limit time in the calving box or pens, we have seen recommendations regarding how we operate, how we work with the different herds. We should have bends for the beginning of drying, a calving box, and then a box for start of lactation and so on. But each time we change the structure of an animal batch will have negative consequences regarding the intake of dry matter. So we should limit the time spent in a pen, and if the housing of cows during the preparation period, maybe we should leave the cows where it is. The importance of activity now, that is of course connected to space available. This is a Stevenson survey of 2020. They monitored animals having pathologies and healthy animals. Those animals having a pathology at the beginning of lactation have an inactive period of time that is higher at the beginning of lactation and hence at the beginning of the pathology, but even before calving, we can see that there is more inactive time for these animals suffering from a pathology. A few recommendations regarding space availability, area availability. These are percentages, of course. If you have 100 cows in your herd, You need 11 boxes in far off, 9 for close up, and you have different recommendations in terms of infirmary and so on and so forth. Immunity. Francis Jalbert talked about that enough. We have an increase in NEFR or decrease in calcemia. This is a publication by Martinez. They showed it very clearly, negative impact in terms of immunity, consequences as well for passive defense resources during hypocalcia. Trace elements and vitamins and the antioxidants possibilities of some of them. On this old publication by Goff, we can note a decrease in tocopherol at calving, and we also have other publications showing that animals developing mastitis at the 30 days of lactation are having tocopherol values that are decreased just before calving, and same thing for beta-carotene, with a possibility of placenta retention being mentioned here. Now, a few words about selenium. A key component for peroxidase glutathione. It has an antioxidant action, a strong action. It plays a key role in neutrophil functions. And for diagnosis tool, we have different possibilities. It can be measured in the blood, or we can have an interest in peroxidase glutathione. It is to be found in the red cells. It has a kind of memory effect for the PG. The role of zinc. Again, an impact regarding decrease in zinc on metritis, risk of big callow. I'm hurrying up because I'm being told that time is flying. Last part of my presentation is connected to the quality of the milk. Here we can mention Bradley's work showed that there was a high contamination risk during the drying period, and that this contamination from bacteria could have consequences for mastitis at the beginning of lactation. So we must be aware of how we manage this dry period. Colostrum quality. With this, we can monitor the way transition is taking place. Energy input, protein input and intake will have an impact on the quality of colostrum in terms of colitis. This can have a beneficial impact. Monitoring to finish. It can be of interest for the whole herd. The idea being to validate the management in place, to also detect possible deviations. And for individual animals, we can identify the risky ones and start corrective measures in order to avoid clinical or even economical consequences. What are we to record then? Well, we record the different pathologies. We want to have access to the production and reproduction data, the data regarding the ingestion of dry matter, and in time the various parameters, the BCS, the measure of urine pH before calving, the bricks at calving, and the BHP at the beginning of lactation. And of course, this is to be adapted depending on the context and environment. Monitoring can be implemented in a very basic way, but depending on the relationship that you are having with the farmer or the herd itself, in case of deviations, you can increase the number of points, or for any audit you can bring more and additional elements. I thank you for your attention. So if you have questions, That'll be after lunch. Thank you very much.